Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Monday night live stream this week. Just really enjoyed last week and the conversations that happened afterwards. Some of you were messaging me, and we were talking and back and forth, and I really value that. That's what we do in the community of faith. And so, if you have further conversation tonight, I would love to hear it. And tonight, I've got a couple questions that I want to answer for you that came in yesterday, and I also want to share a thought with you that didn't quite make it into the sermon on Sunday. It's kind of neat that I quite like. So we had a couple questions about speaking in tongues coming out of the sermon on Sunday. I was asked two questions, and I'm going to answer them together. So I'll just read them both to you. First, is speaking in tongues only speaking in human languages, or are there some other languages that maybe aren't earthly languages? Which is a great question. And then the second part is, what is the benefit of speaking in tongues in a personal relationship with God in prayer if you don't understand what you're saying yourself? So I'm going to answer these to get these together the best I can. So in my understanding, there's kind of three situations in which speaking in tongues happen. First is what we saw at Pentecost, where God gifts the ability to speak and understand a language on earth. So all of a sudden I can speak French or German or something. I've heard of missionaries who felt that God gifted them the ability to either just know a language or learn it very, very quickly. And what a wonderful gift that'd be, a very useful gift if you're ministering to people from other cultures who speak different languages. I mean, what a blessing that is, and what a witness of the Spirit in your life, but also to move your ministry forward and be a witness to those that you're speaking to, just like it was at Pentecost. And so this is what we saw at the Pentecost event in Acts 2, as they learned, people were able to start speaking other people's languages. Very, very cool. And then the second one is kind of, the next two are kind of together, but are also a little bit different. So one of them is a corporate experience of speaking in tongues, and the other one's a very personal speaking in tongues, and they overlap. There are those who speak tongues that aren't necessarily an earthly language. It's a spiritual language, is how it's described by some. And like I said, it can be a personal language that people use in prayer to God, just between them and God, or something that's used in corporate worship. And we see that in some of the Pentecostal churches. And we are told that the purpose of this is it builds up the person speaking in tongues. It builds up the group of believers. So this is not so much as an evangelism focus like happened at Pentecost, but it's a building up of the faith, edifying of faith of those who speak in tongues to see God at work in their life in that way. Think about that. If you know God's giving you this ability, what an affirmation that He's present and caring for you in your life. So my understanding from those I know who pray privately in tongues is that they have some understanding of what they are praying. It's not they're all of a sudden they're just speaking words and they have no idea what it is. The speaking in tongues for them is very much just, it's their own personal prayer language. It's not something I understand because that's not a gift I share with them. But I value that they have that gift and that that's meaningful to them. And they've actually felt at times bad that they have that gift. And they said, Mike, is it okay I have this gift? Like, I feel, I'm like, no, this is a beautiful thing that you have. And if that's your prayer life, that's great. And they value that for their personal prayer life. And then in 1 Corinthians 14, we see that there's some who speak in tongues in worship, in a corporate worship setting. And 1 Corinthians 14 gives some insight into that. And I encourage you to read that if you want to learn even more. Some guidelines. And it's very clear that when this happens, someone else be there to interpret. Now, I don't know if that means the person speaking in tongues doesn't understand what they're saying, or if they do and they need somebody else to affirm that as an accountability thing. Much like it's not uncommon for us to discern in a group together, so we are making sure that we're accountable to each other in the community. But even then, it's very clear that only 2 or 3 people at the most should ever speak in tongues in a service. That it shouldn't be the prominent or dominant part of the worship service, because it can overtake. And when it does happen in those situations, it can be a wonderful reminder of God's work in their life and affirm and build up the believers in faith. But again, it's not an essential part of worship, as we see in 1 Corinthians 14. And if it does happen, it's in a limited way. But people are blessed and affirmed in their faith with that. And some have a gift of interpretation. And it says if you don't have somebody there to interpret, then it should be your private time of prayer or something similar, and not for everybody else. So it's a different gift. We don't see that as publicly in the Mennonite Brethren churches that I've seen, but interesting enough, the MB Church does have some historical ties with the Pentecostal movement and a deep value for that and respect for that. And I respect those who have this gift. I don't believe that these gifts have stopped. Some people do believe that the speaking in tongues doesn't happen anymore, but I've encountered enough people who have this gift, who I value and see in them the working of the Spirit and the presence of God working in and through them. So I value that they have that gift, as I value all the other giftings that are present out there as well. So I hope that helps answer those questions. If you've got other questions or anybody has other questions, feel free to text me at 306-992-2611, and I'll be happy to answer some further questions next week. And that's just kind of a quick answer on those questions. You can do a lot more in-depth answers than that, but the goal of this time is just to be, here's some thought and here's some reflection in answer to your questions, not to be an in-depth theological paper on some topics. But I hope I did some justice to that. Now, before we finish up, I want to share with you a thought on Pentecost in Acts 2 that didn't make it into my sermon. But to do that, I need to sidetrack back to the book of Genesis to give some context. In Genesis 11, we have this curious story of the Tower of Babel. The people are building a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so they can make a name for themselves. But God looks down and sees this tower and what they're building, and he chooses to scatter the people all over the earth, and he confuses their language so they can't communicate with each other. Like I said, they're spread all over the whole earth. The story is actually important for us to understand Pentecost a bit more fully, but it can also be easy to miss the connection. What we see in Genesis is a community focused on themselves and their own gain, and God chooses to spread them out so they can't speak the same language and understand each other. In Acts 2, in the Pentecost story, we see a kind of undoing of the Tower of Babel. We see people from all over, we're told, who gathered together for the Pentecost celebrations, and they don't speak the same regional language. They speak different languages. But they're gathered in the same space, and the Holy Spirit is working through the followers of Jesus and working in them, and they're all of a sudden able to speak the languages of these people from all over. And what we see happen is a community brought together through the gifting of the Holy Spirit. It's a community that doesn't seek their own power and gain like the city of Babel, but a community that's going to be marked by generosity and care and love. And we see God bringing back together a community where before he drove it apart because of sinfulness and selfishness and greed and those things. And he sees and he brings together these people here through his Spirit. And we see a contrast between the world-focused city in Babel and God's kingdom-focused community that comes to take shape in Acts. And it's this beautiful image of God at work. And I love that image present in the story of Pentecost, that this is bigger than just a one-time event. This is part of the whole narrative of history, that God is at work moving things towards reconciliation and healing. And through the death and resurrection, ascension, and ultimate return of Jesus, he's making all things new, including community. And that's marked in this Pentecost passage. So I wanted to share that because I think that can get lost sometimes amidst of all the other details. It did make it into my sermon on Sunday, and so I hope you find some value in that. Thanks for joining me tonight, and if you have any more questions or if I see any in the Facebook comments, I'll answer them next week on our Monday Night Live gathering at 7 p.m. Have a great night, and God bless.